Thank you all. Thank you all for being here and joining us tonight for our event with Mike Puican and Michael Warr. This event is co-presented by Friends of the San Francisco Public Library. I want to thank you all for joining us. My name is Evan Karp. I am the events manager for Booksmith. We're an independent bookstore and mainstay of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district since 1976. Tonight, though, we are, of course, here to celebrate the new book by Mike Puican, Central Air Poems. Tonight, the Michaels will be reading place-based poems set mostly in Chicago and in San Francisco. I'm just going to give a brief intro to each, and then I'll get out of the way. Mike Puican has published poems in Poetry, Bloomsbury Review, Crab Orchard Review, and New England Review, among others. His work has also been featured on WBEZ, Chicago's NPR affiliate. Puican was a member of the 1996 Chicago Slam team and holds an MFA in poetry from Warren Wilson College. As a longtime board member of the Guild Literary Complex in Chicago, he's been deeply involved in supporting and promoting other Chicago writers. He also leads poetry workshops at St. Leonard's House for formerly incarcerated men and at the Federal Metropolitan Correctional Center in Chicago. Michael Warr's books include A Poetry in Protest, From Emmett Till to Trayvon Martin, and from Tia Chucha Press, The Armageddon of Funk. And I'm sorry? Oh, had a little feedback there. Oh. He's the recipient of the 2020 Berkeley Lifetime Achievement Award and is a San Francisco Library Laureate. Other honors include a Creative Work Fund Award, Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Award for Excellence in Literature, Black Caucus at the American Library Association Award, Gwendolyn Brooks Significant Illinois Poets Award, and a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. Michael is a former deputy director of the Museum of the African Diaspora and is a board member of the Friends of the San Francisco Public Library. You can follow his creative work at michaelwarr-creativework.tumblr.com. That's it for me. Welcome, Mike Puican. Congratulations on the book. And Michael Warr, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Good. Evan, thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to kick it off. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to read a few poems. Michael then will come in and ask me a question. Michael Warr will read, and then I will ask him a question. And then after that, we will take questions from the audience. And I encourage everybody to ask questions because this is a community event and not a couple of people talking to you. So we'd like to have you join us. So I'm going to start off. Michael Warr and I are going to talk about cities that we know very well. I'm going to represent Chicago. I have lived most of my adult life, all of my adult life in Chicago. I came to Chicago when I was 19 years old. I hitchhiked here. I came from the town I grew up in, which was a little town in Pennsylvania, in the rural Appalachian Mountains in Pennsylvania. And about as long as I could remember, I wanted to get to the big city. And so I came to Chicago and just stayed. I came with a big fascination for Chicago, and I still have that fascination. And that works its way into a number of my poems. One similarity that both Michael and I, that both Chicago and San Francisco have, is that they're both cities of immigrants. I think that makes the cities eminently stronger and more interesting to be in and live in. This first poem is a celebration of that fact, and it's called Immigrant Grasses. Words overheard in garden shops, uptown and earnest, blossom into cablegrams from South Korea or Cameroon. Oleander, unscented blue star, becomes a refugee from a royal Malaysian family exhausted from her long ocean voyage. Gladioli, pale green and unblossomed, in uncertain translation become voluminous and blood red. Common yellow snapdragons conjure the emblazoned railway embankments of Bucharest. Radiant, reassembled, Worlds arise from colonnades of cosmos, from nasturtium and bloodroot, reshaped on someone's far-traveled tongue. Alyssum of the untold losses, immigrant grasses rising through the floorboards. Unsettled, urgent, images created by gardeners and railway conductors, shipbuilders and fruit polishers, nurturers, whose worlds crest broad-leafed and crimsoned, whose words offer the chance to grow fluent in something that has no concern over what meanings are indigenous. The title of this reading, Michael and I have decided, was Lunch Poems, which of course is from Frank O'Hara's very famous City Light Books book that was launched in 1965. Now, Frank was famous for writing about the city, specifically New York City. And his work was not coming as an outsider, but with the specificity of someone who was very much a part of it. He was very much a New Yorker. His work influenced a generation of poets, and Michael and I are both poets who stand on the foundation that he set. The title, Lunch Poems, was to indicate that all of the poems were written during the lunch hour, Frank O'Hara's lunch hour from his job. And in this way, I think he's just like all the rest of us writers, trying to create our art in the cracks of trying to make a living. For me, a lot of my poems are written in coffee shops, back when you could go to coffee shops, but hopefully we will do that again. But I love to sit in a coffee shop with the large windows and just look out at the city. I start by just writing down what I see. But I've learned over time, even if I don't have a single idea, over time, observation will turn into poetry. So I'm going to read a poem that sort of reenacts that. It's called Man Digging a Sidewalk. All morning at a busy intersection, under a large elm, a young man with thick, short arms digs up a sidewalk. He works steadily, at his own pace. I watch him and the elm's leaves turned yellow and edged with brown. A teenager walks past the young man and over the mounds of dirt. She's leading her dog, a chihuahua that is dressed as a honeybee. The morning's light pours over the girl and her dog. As they climb another mound, the dog turns to me and says, "Don't fuck with me. I am boundless. I am capable of anything." These are the early days of autumn. The mind soars. Let our bodies keep watch over the work. So I just had my first book of poetry published. That's the back cover. Very interesting. Here's the first cover. I'm thrilled with how it looks. Thank you, whoever's applauding. The cover art is a painting. It's not a photograph. It's a painting by the master painter, Julia Haw. It's getting a lot of attention because it is a book about the city and about urban living. But I didn't set out to write a book about the city. My interest was different than that. My interest was in writing about the common experience that we all have. We all breathe the same air, but we all dream. We all want to be loved. We all are trying to improve our lives, no matter how misguided and mistake-filled, I'll speak for myself, they sometimes are. So the book is about the common experience. And for me, that's the air. That's the central air that binds us all together. In Chicago, one of the things that binds us all together is public transportation. There is a commuter train system. It's really a very good system for moving people through the city, called the L. It's largely an elevated line that goes through the city, and the red line is the main artery. So it starts almost at the edge, the southern edge of Chicago, and goes past the northern boundary. It moves hundreds of thousands of people every day, or it used to. Now it moves about 10 people a day. But when it is moving the way it was designed to, it is a great window to the city. This poem is an ode to the Red Line. It's called Red Line. Knife slicing the living night. Nacreous River, we've stood waiting for you so many times before, and still we wait. River of departure, arrival, departure, container of all ambition, you make us what we are, employable, fuckable. Night blue finger tracing the lake shore, airstream of avarice and hearts askew, carved into the suddenly valuable land of broken down homes and buried children. Our hopes, our bodies fill you, conductor, with your metal cheeks, your 200-watt eyes offering glimpses of bedrooms, overstuffed chairs and their punishments, storefronts lit up like flames. You carry day traders dressed for sentencing, young mothers working on their resumes, outcasts busking for change. In your care, a steady ticking, the learned comfort of metal on metal, the caress of night feathers. Oh, snake amongst the roses, we await your approach, the cold snap of your doors flung wide open. I want to thank Booksmith, and I want to thank Friends of the San Francisco Public Library for sponsoring this. These are both important institutions that not only support literature, but they also help to keep literature a community activity, like events like tonight. And I think that's so important. I'd also like to recognize someone who's had a big hand in my development as a writer, and that is C. Dale Young. C. Dale, he's an overachiever. Not only is he one of the top oncologists in San Francisco, he's also one of the top poets in the country. And I studied with him 10 years ago. I was very fortunate. I know that he doesn't get off work until right about now, so I don't know if he's listening, but C. Dale, if you are, thank you. I'm going to read one more for right now. This one is entitled Chicago, and it's inspired by the great poet Gwendolyn Brooks. Gwendolyn is a link that both Michael Warr and I have. We both knew her. Michael knew her better than I did, but I was very honored to have some interactions with her. Not only is she a generous person and a big supporter of writers, a big supporter of emerging writers, but she's a fierce writer. And I have always felt that she has not gotten adequate attention for how fiercely she was involved in social justice and how her poems pushed for major social improvement. I have included a line from one of her poems in this. Excuse me. I just listened to a reading by another poet who said that he had been advised that you can't speak slowly enough when you're reading, doing a reading. And I have just the opposite problem. The line from the Gwendolyn Brooks poem is, "If thou be more than hate or atmosphere, step forth in splendor. mortify our wolves. I have woven that line into this poem, and appropriate for this reading, it's called Chicago. City of car alarms, a chair flying out a second-story window. No one asks if there's a story. Cigarettes in a doorway. The congregation at Sunday service is holier than thou, but not indifferent to the tangled cable of voices calling for change to be now. A young mother carries a fight for $15 an hour sign. She has plans for more than quilts on the floor and cardboard taped on broken windows. She has hopes for more than listening to city officials who hate to lose explain why a teenage boy was shot 16 times. Black Lives Matter signs are seen on front lawns and apartment windows while protesters lock arms to stop traffic. An atmosphere of sadness and outrage permeates the city. Let us step forth alongside the dreams of bricklayers, smelt fishers, patched up families in line at Walgreens, old women and men walking down the street in splendor, electricians and store managers tossing back shots, shouting insults to mortify all those who ignore the sounds of bell trains, furniture flying out windows, and our loud, cacophonous voices rising until we free ourselves of these witless, willful wolves. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was, wow, really amazing. Just stunning and beautiful and crafted like a master. And I really want to encourage people to buy the book. Even while I'm reading, you can, order the book. That's really important. But the question that comes to mind, seeing how well these poems are crafted and the depth that's in them, I think it answers why it took so long. But that's my question. What took so long to get to this first book? And by the way, I can't believe that I didn't know this about you. We both arrived in Chicago at the age of 19. And we're not the same age, but we arrived there at the age of 19.
No kidding. Okay, that's when our lives began.
Yeah. What took you so long, man?
What took me so long? Well, I don't know. What was I doing before I got my book published? Anyway, so the background is, I sent my manuscript out for about 18 years before it was accepted. Probably, I counted, it's like 145 times. And okay, I got close a few times, but here's the point. It was rarely the same manuscript. Like, my work wasn't ready to be published 18 years ago. And as I continued to work, continued to write, I'd send a manuscript out, and then while I was waiting to hear, I'd keep changing it, revising it, moving poems around. It took that long for it to be, honestly, for it to be ready. Was I ready for it to be sooner? Absolutely. Was the manuscript ready? Not so much. I'm very proud of this, and I'm very proud that today the book is what it is, and it's published.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, it's I can say that my first book, looking at the writing then, is dramatically different from my writing today. So I think that there's something to a book taking that amount of time to come out. It really kind of speaks to where you are. I currently don't feel I have a book yet that really reflects me. I feel the writer I am today. I feel my last book, which I'm going to read from tonight, is, I call it a hybrid, because it's the old me and some of the new me. So anyway, thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank you, Michael.
I've lived in three cities, and each one of them have had such a major impact on my life that I'm going to read about each one of them. And I'm going to squeeze as much as I can into the next 15 minutes. I'm going to move in between these cities a few times tonight, and everything in these poems are about things that actually happened. And I'm going to start with a few San Francisco poems. I moved from San Francisco to Chicago, like I said, when I was around 19, and many of my poems about San Francisco are actually, they were actually written in Chicago. And I think that that reflects the age I was. I had, only a few years out of high school. And they also were written after my time in Addis Ababa, where I was a foreign correspondent, which also happened pretty early in my life. So that's also reflected in my poetry. The first one is a San Francisco poem called My Father's Favorite Pastime. On edge of the darkest ghetto stood Candlestick Park, lit bright as an A-bomb's flash. With tiny hands, I turned a bazooka-scented baseball card of Willie Mays. Rows of shattering batting stats dispersed into smoke, while Willie stuck like skin. Unforgettably black like my mother, whose schoolmates called Shinola. Black like her son, who Abyssinians would one day call Red Black. In the shadow of America's spectacle, still nothing mattered but blackness. Against the night's cruel chill, we huddled against the hawk, sipping Ghirardelli chocolate in search of baseball's hearth. Fat with peanuts and Cracker Jacks, a white man sold us something silver, shiny, wallet-shaped. Wrapping it in a velvet pouch, deep blue and fit for royalty, my father handed me the mystery, warmer than a Sunday oven, bringing mad joy to my hands. I felt that warmer for centuries in an unlocked, chaotic drawer, packed with memories, junk, imagination, the blaze in its metal guts, stealing even Willie's thunder. And this is another poem that I consider, it's a pivotal San Francisco poem, at least for me. It's called The First Time Ever. In my 68 Volvo on a sloping street outside the house where I taught myself about preludes, danced to James Brown and Calypso, while my mother tried to waltz me, where she allowed my zoo of beetles, frogs, and ladybugs bottled in her living room. Outside that museum of my youth, a Colombian revolutionary escaped from the bucket seat, leaned across the stick shift, and strapped me into first love with a kiss. Our eyes flared across enlightened rooms crowded with cadre in picturesque Victorian flats in San Francisco's Mission, where the Symbionese Liberation Army and Squeaky Fromm fabricated faulty solutions. At their antique dining table, we shared utopian super burritos from Las Palmas near the Panaderia and Maoist bookstore, blared music loud to deny the FBI our whispered strategy and tactics, studied Vladimir's What Is to Be Done as the Isley brothers' Who's That Lady spun conspiratorially. On a couch in my boyhood bedroom in front of a window she would not notice until we too were wide open. All the dialectical discussions were lost in the tearing off of clothes. As I told her, I wanted first to read a book on how to do it so that I would do it right. She kept tearing off her clothes, not letting her husband, Dos Niños, or my 19-year-old naivety distract her 29-year-old wisdom. I quit the Bank of America's promise of a perfect bourgeois future to be a full-time functionary, taunt from pseudo-unemployment, stomach flat as a stack of Leninist leaflets. On the way to meetings, she flipped her hands into my baggy pants and pulled lightly as I shifted gears. And this is one from Chicago, somewhat in the same vein. It's called A Wild Morning on Fullerton. This happened long before I was married. A Wild Morning on Fullerton. An avenue wide as an urban prairie, a Chicago girl's legs long and enthralling, conquering the gritty pavement and my wandering eyes, careening across the ashy road, galloping full throttle in a maroon-skinned steed of Swedish origin, window lowered to tempt a blonde stranger suddenly, simply, wanted like fire wanting wood. I drift out of character and out of place, drunk on delusion-driven hope, on my way to feed a friend's cat. A morning as gray as the city's cracked concrete, marred in cuts of crisscrossing rivers and tracks of storied traffic. I drive this borrowed beast of burden with newfound testosterone pumping. Surprisingly, she accepts my spur of the second invitation and rides beside me through surreal streets in silence or sophisticated banter or mutual disbelief, speeding toward a fuck in the midst of a house sitting. Did I even feed the cat? Was a bottle of El Presidente our coyote? Or is it my half-cocked memory? Did we slow dance, bathe, shower, talk, or hand each other names? How did we end up naked? I remember only the 6-inch blade she placed on the sheets between our bodies. This next poem is about both San Francisco and Chicago. It's a transitional poem. After 25 years in Chicago, which were interrupted by 5 years in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, we were moving back, both Patricia Zamora and I were moving back to California. And so this was a poem that kind of came out of me during that period of transition. It's called Street Signs, Convolutions, and Other California Coincidences. All of the poems I've read so far are from my second book, The Armageddon of Funk, from Teatrice Press. Street Signs, Convolutions, and Other California Coincidences. 1, somehow the bus driver drove his mammoth rush hour machinery into my father's head, dropping him to the Market Street asphalt dazed but not yet dead. His high yellow body sprawled momentarily, his mind stuck at work, keen selves into the old school register on Levin's Auto Supply's thick glass counter. 2, on a Chicago boulevard lined in conspiring trees, the street signs that surround us sing California, Sacramento, Richmond, and Francisco. A sturdy sunburnt grain man cutting the rowdy grass outside the corner church says he too is called Francisco. I say it is also the name of my wife's late brother. 3, in the Volvo on the way to Zion, Illinois, we wear out Jose Feliciano's song. He is not the only Californian dreaming. 4, in Patricia's mind, Livingston is Shangri-La, 20 minutes outside Modesto, California. She picks grapes sweet with sunshine from a meandering bush enveloping a neighbor's mailbox. Another neighbor from India brings a basket of tiny blue chicken eggs and remembers the bucket of tangerines that her father, Rufino, handed him over a fence he'd built himself. 5, 20 years after the crippled smile froze to the left side of my father's stroke-shaped face, I unknowingly arrive where Levin's once stood, a lustrous temple of cultural philanthropy, where spark plugs, tailpipes, and distributor caps once hung from the walls. Creativity is prominently displayed, shuffled, rejected, sustained, and I sell art where my father sold auto parts. So this next series of poems is something that I call Fragmented Stills, and none of these have been published. I've been working on a series, on this series for a while now, and they capture a moment, is the intention. They capture a moment in time, and they're rooted in a location based in an incident or experience that I witnessed or was near or was involved in, or a place where I was present. and they are short story poems slipping in and out of time. The dates that I will give with the titles are all about when the occurrence took place. They're not signifying when the poems were written. And this is the first one I wrote. 24th and York Street, Dynamo Donut and Coffee, San Francisco, 2016. A burgundy-haired woman rides toward me, bare-bottomed on her flower-speckled blue bike, shaven, stern, and pink all over. These are all true stories. San Bruno Avenue and Mansell, San Francisco, 1973. A .357 Magnum shakes in the officer's hands, shoved in another black boy's face, inches away from this irrational fear of another unarmed black child. We are waiting for the 27 Bryant bus. I protest, as the Black Panthers who leafleted my junior high school would want me to. I stand still in the fright-filled space of insanity 2 blocks from my family home, 2 months post my high school graduation, a century after legislative criminalization, nearly 50 years before this not so different day. Eddie and Gulf Street, San Francisco, 2015. The manicured edges of Jackson Square soothes the mountain lion's paws after stalking survival through wild city blocks. City Hall hovers in the moonlit background of the urban canopy growing like a tripping starship. The big cat's nocturnal pacing, captured frame by frame under peering eyes of surveilling street lamps, reflects the artificial sun glistening against its golden coat. Scenting the tracks of its hunted ancestors, it strides past our sleeping fortress where we shelter safely behind white stone and window panes. The visitor to its former land approaches Fillmore West. Ministry of Defense, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, 1975. Mistaken again for an Ethiopian, a bayoneted rifle is reared back, suspended in mid-air, aimed to pierce my Adonis stomach as I announce my appointment with the minister. My jarring American accent as alien to the peasant militia guard as H.R. Geiger's alien. I shout, I do not speak Amharic, interrupting death again. Northern Ashland, Chicago, still working on this one, 1991. Turning left at the corner, Hollywood Grill, in the act of memorizing poetry, a hit and run sideswipes me back into the shocking prose of the everyday. A suave linebacker of another brother arrives at the scene of the crime, styling a badge and holstered revolver. He commandeers my license, returns to his squad car to check my bona fides. Walking toward me, he waves a book, turns the covers, flexing Black Panther with black heart toward me. Is this you? This is the book. This is the book. Turning right this time, down an industrial, I messed that up. Walking toward me, he waves a book, turns the covers, flexing Black Panther with black heart towards me. Is this you? This is the book. This is the book. I am unprepared. Actually, I am lost. What are you doing with that? I asked. Turning right this time down an industrial lined street, heading toward Nelson Algren's old neighborhood, I noticed the same officer parked on the side of the road behind the wheel, still embracing the panther. Okay, so those are some of my fractured steel poems. And I just have 2 more I'm gonna end with. Place is the central theme of my poetry. I could easily have spent the 15 minutes on any of the 3 cities. This poem I recite often, and it was conceived at the Velvet Lounge Jazz Club in Chicago. It's called Hallucinating at the Velvet Lounge. When Malachi blew his horn, I dreamed of cornbread, yellow mounds with burnt edges on the velvet's culinary altar, His sharp-cut riffs morphed into squares of cornbread islands, floating in streams of warm butter, clinging to the ribs of my memory, speaking in trumpet tongues of passages and uprisings, ancient pain and good time jiving, sacred beats and blues timing, drive-by crying and signifying, an opiate inside of oppression. Crater chunk of bacon infused, sweet potato, chicken smothered, maple pecan, custard filled, smackling, crackling, jalapeno inflamed cornbread. The crepe of the slave now sold at Whole Foods in this jazz-drenched town built of golden bricks and smokestacks. Billowing fumes of corn on the cob and catfish, my mind lost in music and metaphysics, reminiscing the Sunday manna served beside my mother's succotash. Okay, I'm gonna end it there, and thank you. A little bit of San Francisco, a little bit of Ethiopia.
Nice. So, Michael, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. That was wonderful. It's been so long since I've heard you read, and there was one poem that I recognized that I've heard you read before, which was terrific. I was going to ask if you if you write from an outside view of place or as an inside view, but hearing you read your poems, I think I know the answer. I mean, everything that you are reading seems to have sieved through Michael Warr with the vision that you have, with the particulars that you select, and so
yeah. I think that the thing is that I think that's mostly true, and that's mostly what I write about. I was a journalist, obviously. That's especially during that period I was in Ethiopia. So I actually journalism has a big impact on my writing, and I'm an observer and I'm a descriptor. But I've been writing poetry since the 9th grade, and most of the time, because these things have happened to me, because I have been in the midst of them, I write about them, and it just so happens that they really took place, right? But I used to want to be a science fiction writer, and there you might be imagining more. And I do write some things often that I don't necessarily know about, or there's a small thing that leads to writing an entire poem. The way the Fragmented Stills poem started was when I saw that woman on the bike. I said, I capture these things on my phone and I write down something about it so I can go back to it. And I thought to myself, I would go back to that and maybe it would become an extended poem. But what I realized when I was going through this is that, wow, these are already poems. This is a poem within itself. It doesn't have to become anything else. And I would just say lastly, more and more I'm getting asked to write things. I'm not the best poet to be asked to write something, or I'm invited to something to write about. And that's a case where I am writing something that I was not inside of it myself, but I connected to some part of my life that kind of makes it real. And it's more of an imagining. An example of it is a poem I write about the poet Bob Kaufman, which I didn't know about Kaufman. But when I was asked to do that reading, I realized that this book that had a profound influence on me, 3,000 Years of Black Poetry, which I stole in high school, that's where I met your mother, Nora. That's where I met Gwendolyn Brooks. I met her in that book. And Bob Kaufman was one of the poets in that book. And, he just didn't strike me the way some of the other poets in that anthology did, so there was a connection there, and I was able to kind of take that small connection and draw as much out of it as possible.
Michael, that is so clear. I think, though, that collection of observations and poems, poetry that you put together, that the last section is just terrific. And you sneak autobiographical things in there, which is a lot of fun.
Thanks.
Okay, I know we've spent time on it, but let me ask you my question. And that is,
I thought that was your question.
no, that was an observation.
Sorry about that.
That's good. So, so you were instrumental in helping the poetry scene in Chicago, which had ripples across the country, sort of come out of academia and come out of a lot of the more hallowed halls of poetry and into bars and coffee shops and, you know, on street corners. And then you moved to San Francisco. So I am just a little curious if you see a difference, if you can characterize the poetry scenes in Chicago and in San Francisco.
Wow, that's a very interesting question. One of the things I can say for sure is that I was different. It's harder for me to talk about, you know, I mean, obviously the scenes were probably different, the culture is different, the makeup of the cities are different. So all of that, no doubt, has an impact, but I was different. So when I first was engaged in, you know, as an organizer, I like to say it, in the poetry scene in Chicago, I was very, very engaged. I mean, I would be at the Green Mill every Sunday night, and I would be taking down poets' names. And I'll never forget one day when Mark Smith called me, Mark Smith, who founded the Poetry Slam and ran the Green Mill series. Mark came to me and asked me for that list that I had been putting together, because I had everybody's names on that on the list, because I would literally go through the Green Mill with a clipboard writing down people's names, emails, and numbers that they hadn't emailed yet. And so by the time, it wasn't very long after that I wasn't really there every Sunday anymore. I just had too many other things to do running and forming the Guild complex. And so that's one of the reasons I had so many volunteers. I had volunteers out there in the world at all of these different venues. And by the time I got to San Francisco, I wasn't organizing any poetry. That was not a part of my life. I was not going to a lot of open mics. But the parallel was that I immediately found a place in the Mission in San Francisco called the Red Poppy Art House. And it's as like, you know, the arts organization from another mother. You know, it was an organization that really had that feel of community. You know how at the Guild, if you wanted something, if you needed something, let's say you needed a designer, or you needed a plumber, or you needed someone who taught fiction, or you needed a scientist. All of these people were at the Guild complex. You know, it was a community of people from a broad swipe of society. And the Red Poppy was like that, you know, just this community of people, some of which were artists. And so I found that parallel, but I really did not experience San Francisco at that point the way I had experienced emerging as a poet in Chicago. So, sorry. I'm sure the scenes are different, but they're both great.
Yeah, right.
So are we going to open it up now?
Yeah, hi. This has been wonderful. Thank you both so much for these readings and for your insights. We do have a question. I'd like to encourage you all to add a question in the chat if you have one. This first one comes from Maureen, and this is for you both. Hey, Maureen. Observation is a path to poetry, and Maureen would love to hear more about how and where you've done that.
Say that again. Hear more about what?
So you've mentioned observation as a path to poetry, and Maureen's would love to hear more about how and where you've done that. I mean, of course, we've heard the three places, Michael, that you've shared, and Mike, of course, Chicago, but perhaps and the cafe that you mentioned as well. But if there are other places, perhaps that you tend to go to observe poetry, or is it more perhaps kind of a spontaneous thing, like you were saying, Michael, about something, perhaps somebody on a bicycle riding past you or the like. Do you have go-to spots?
Go ahead, Mike.
Let me start. So observation, I'll speak for me, not for poets, is a path to poetry. Just writing down. I mean, take a look at what's on your table and just write down what's on that table. There is something that lifts. There is something that separates from your vision to the words, that allow the words to have some play, and for the words to be objects themselves that then can be manipulated into poems, or at least a poetic observation. So for me, hard objects in my world are a pathway to that. And then I can get a little, off outside the borders. But it starts with what's here right now. And that's how it is a pathway for me.
Yeah, I've always felt that I could write a poem about anything, but I don't. I really don't write very many poems. And there's one thing I love about what's going on in my life right now, because I'm being engaged so much, I am writing more. There was a long period of time where I was barely writing. And I always need what I call a spark for something to become a poem. Because I also have done journalism, I've also done technical writing, I've written speeches, I've been writing in different forms all my life. And so what distinguishes this particular thing, from the prose piece and the poetic piece? And for me, it had the thing that makes me write something is that spark that makes me want to take language and do something different with it. I love the process of editing. It's my favorite part of writing. And I even for something as short as that first fragmented piece I wrote, which basically is a sentence. I mean, there are a lot of drafts on that sentence. But also I have always been driven since childhood, to write about what's going on in the world around me. Often I am deciding what I read and what I write based on what I feel needs to be responded to that's going on in the world. That's who I am. And typically every reading I've done since, all these Zoom readings since May, which average out to about 5 a month, I've been reading a lot of the same poems over and over because I think that those poems are particularly relevant to the moment. And that's how I decide what I'm going to do. So tonight is actually, I'm loving the fact that we decided to read on cities, because to some degree, by having that theme, it liberates me from what I typically read. I didn't read hardly any of the poems that I've been reading for the last few months. And that's why I wanted my information to be in the chat, because starting Friday, I will be reading I'll be starting reading those poems again. Of course, I like to mix it up, but I speaking of observational, I respond a lot to the world around me.
Wonderful. Thank you both. And thanks for that question. The next one, kind of tying in, Pat Zamora is wondering if you have any revelations regarding poetry in the pandemic, if you have more to add about that, Michael or Mike.
Go ahead, Mike. She's in the kitchen, so I have to decide if I turn to her and answer that or not.
Love you, Michael.
She just happens to be in the kitchen getting tea. She's not always in the kitchen. Go ahead, Mike.
There are a lot of poets who this has just ignited a whole set of poems and about the current situation. I I haven't been one of those poets. So for me, I, I have a hard time writing about what's in the moment. I write about what was in last year. It takes that long to kind of to simmer and for me to synthesize what's going on. So I'll be writing my pandemic poems next year when coronavirus is all solved.
Yeah, again, I feel good about the fact that I get requests to participate in things, and I'm not typically a good poet to be asked to write something. But earlier in the year, the Chinese Cultural Center in San Francisco asked me to participate in a project they were doing where they're asking artists how they were coping with and how they were responding to the pandemic. And this was in the context of Asians being attacked, and in the context of the president of the United States, using terms, that were despicable and that were actually fueling attacks against people in this country who are Asian ancestry. And so I wrote a piece that they asked me to do, and this was unusual for me because they wanted it in a video, and they also wanted it in a matter of like days. And by the time I got to it, and I typically just don't write that way. I might write it, but I'm not ready to release it to the world. I mean, I have a poem that I worked on for 10 years. So I am trying to come out with my work more quickly when it's about what's going on, because I just kind of feel compelled to do that. And so with that particular piece called To Your Assailant Who Attacks Us All, I wrote it within 3 days. And then by the 5th day, I was self-videotaping myself reciting the poem outside the Asian Art Museum here in San Francisco. And I had to turn it in on Monday. So that was like a journalistic deadline. And again, when I first named it, I called it To Your Assailant Who Attacks Us All, a rant in progress, because I expected I would have to be coming back to this poem, updating it, rewriting it. No, it has not changed a bit. And so I took that rant part of it out because it's done. That doesn't always happen, but that is one of the impacts that not just the pandemic, but just the level of crises in this country, has had on my writing, is that I don't hold on to it as long as I kind of let go of the fact that this might not be quite where I want it to be, but I get it just as close to, a point where I'm satisfied with it, that I say, okay, I'm ready to release this to the world.
Thank you, and thanks for that question. So the next one is from Billy Lombardo. Billy is wondering, who were a few of the first people that you each heard doing poetry live and just blowing your minds? I have a feeling this would be a fun answer.
I will start, please. Sure. When I did not write poetry, I was going through an awful time in my life. I was getting a divorce. I was losing custody of my child, and I stepped into the hothouse. The Guild Complex had an event there. It was Wednesday, and I couldn't believe what I saw. So the people that I first heard who blew my mind were Patricia Smith. Hi, Patricia. Lisa Biscani, Sheila Donahue, Reggie Gibson. There's many others, but that was the cream of the crop, and I just couldn't believe the poetry that they were coming out with. How about you, Michael?
Well, of course I say amen to that, and or amen ditto. I mean, because a lot of those same poets had that impact on myself and on my writing too. That's the thing that I realize more and more. I talk about this in the acknowledgments in my second book, The Armageddon of Funk, that Chicago poetry scene had a profound impact on me. And the more I write and the more I go back to some of my writing, I can see some of those poets in my poems. But also outside of that scene, I have to say that someone like Quincy Troop, also had a profound impact on me. Gwendolyn Brooks had that impact on me when I was still in high school. And to read her poem, the pool players, and to be influenced by that in elementary school, and then to actually hear her read it, in Chicago years later, there's something about the cadence and the song within the poem that also had a profound influence on me. So I had this kind of situation where both the poets within the performance poetry scene that I was seeing every week were kind of influencing me, but so were these other poets who had been around for a while and had their own styles that they'd already had going on for decades, And I'm very, very influenced by music, and it has a really big impact on the way I recite.
Beautiful, thank you. That actually is a question from Patricia Smith, who is wondering. Sorry, it's about that you have a natural rhythm. I'm sorry, this is from Andrea Change. I'm sorry, but this is from you, Michael Warr. There's such an inherent rhythm to your poetry. Is there a music that you fall back on to or listen to in relationship?
That's amazing. I've been listening to all kinds of different music all my life, and when I write about my poetic influences, I always talk about that. I talk about how my father one day came home with three reel-to-reel tapes, and one was the Appassionata by Beethoven. One was it was a Chet Atkins song, and I can't remember what the third one was, but it was jazz. And so I've always been influenced by these different forms of music, and before hip hop became hip hop, I was very much influenced by that. When I need to think and need to tune things out, I tend to turn to jazz. Because I like doing multiple things at once. I multitask, and sometimes I need to slow down. And when I do that, I turn off the television, and I listen to something like Impressions by John Coltrane. And sometimes these things get stuck in my head, and I just keep listening to them over and over again. And I think what it does, it allows me to have that at a point in the background, but still have my mind doing different things because I'm familiar with what I'm listening to. And I often think about what music I would want to have in scenes and movies. That's my secret desire as a poet, is to make films that are poems.
Looking forward to your video poem at the Bob Kaufman event. Speaking of, so this next question is from Patricia Smith, and I'm going to kind of put a couple together. This is for you both. Can you talk about your personal poetic trajectories? Mike P, how did WW change your work? I think for me that's What Women. I'm not sure if that's another dub. Mike W, what's the hold up on that next poetry book? And then another question I love to put on the end there, because it's one that I also am curious about. If Donald Trump wins re-election, how would your work change? Would it have to? And would poetry's mission be forced to change? So there's a lot there, but I know you guys are both up for it.
Can I take a minute and answer the last part of that? If Donald Trump wins, our mission is the same. okay, he's the worst person on earth, but if Biden wins, we have a lot of work to do. And so the world just doesn't come to equanimity, to heaven if Biden is elected. We've got a lot of work to do, and it's not our job, but it is available for those who try to communicate through writing to be able to address what we have to, the situations that need to be remedied. So that's the start. Mike, if you want to go next, go ahead, and I can suggest the Warren Wilson question, or take the Warren Wilson question.
Yes, I agree with that. First of all, I think it's right on target, that it's kind of a question of tactics, what next? And I just want to speak to the time that we're in itself, because the thing is that if you think about the things that have happened in this country this year, I mean, just look at the Black Lives Movement alone. The book that I published, that I edited, the anthology of poetry and protest, from Emmett Till to Trayvon Martin, came out in 2016, the first print. The second one was in 2019. But one of the part of the impetus for that was the Black Lives Matters movement. Now look at the impact and the the degree of acceptance of that movement under these conditions compared to the conditions just 3 years ago. And so I see the times we are in as an opportunity, and we cannot let up off the gas. We cannot let up off the pedal. We have to use it to transform our condition as much as we can. And unfortunately, it sometimes takes the level of horror that we have reached to for society to start moving. Because believe me, it ain't enough to just write poems about it and to talk about it. You have to interact with these different sections of society that are ready for transformation. So, I mean, that's the way I look at the situation now and the situation post-Trump.
There's a line from the book Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe that I love, and the guy who's the president of the universe is a hapless guy. He signs some document. He thinks it's it's an autograph, but he signs the order to destroy the whole universe. And the person who's with him is saying, "Do something." He said, "I can't do anything." She said, "You're the president." He said, "The president doesn't have any power. The president's job is to distract people's attention away from those who do have power." Whoever's president, there are the people in power either way. And we have to focus our attention on that. Sorry for the diatribe.
So what were you going to say about Warren Wilson?
So I went to grad school, and after being a poet for many, many years, it was a great experience for me. And here's what it did. MFA programs get a lot of crap, but when I went there, I was doing some really good writing on this many things, and Warren Wilson showed me how to expand the tools, to expand my writing in the areas that I hadn't thought of, that were uncomfortable for me. And so I have that to use. So this was, I didn't expect that. I expected to write better poems, but my skills are now broader as a result of grad school. It was an invaluable experience.
And the last time I saw Patricia Smith face to face, she pretty much asked me that same question. So, about my, where's that book? So I expect that question from her, and I appreciate it. I feel right now that I have a lot of work that, as I said, my last book, The Armageddon of Funk, was a hybrid, because it's a long story, but I only just say that it's poems from a manuscript that was lost, that was stolen 20 years earlier. And by the time I got to getting over them being stolen and starting to go through them again, I realized my writing was changing, and I didn't really know what was going on, but my writing was changing dramatically. And so I spent years trying to rewrite many of those poems, and I wound up throwing like half of them away. And then finally they were part of the Armageddon of Funk, which also included new poems. So it was a hybrid book in the sense that it was the old me and some of the new me. And so I do want to have a book that more reflects where I am as a writer now. And I feel like I'm developing, I have a good body of work, because I took every single poem I had left when the Armageddon of Funk came out and put that out. So yeah, it makes sense, Patricia, for me to be thinking of that next book. But also I am really, I have been for over 20 years, very much engaged in digital technology. And I'm very excited about digital formats, platforms for poetry. I have a website called Tracing Poetic Memory in Bayview Hunters Point, which is a digital project of images and poetry. I want to turn of poetry and protest into a digital project. I have a poem called What Not to Do, an unfinished poem, which is a poem that covers as a serial poem the police killings, and it updates it. Well, I want to have that in a digital site where the updates are available to the readers all the time, as opposed to only when I'm reading the poem at an event. So yes, I got to get another book out there in the world, but I'm also very committed to these digital platforms.
Thank you both for fielding those somewhat difficult questions. I have a question from Faye, who's wondering, how did you two come up with the theme of place-based poems for this event?
Michael, you wanna tell the story?
No, you go. You tell the story, but and then I'll just add a little bit.
So we were trying to come up with a theme for our writing, and Michael, this is as you told it to me. So I threw out a bunch of titles. One of them was lunch poems. Just trying to think of, some way that we could have a consistent approach. And Michael said, I have lunch poems and your book in my bathroom right now, and those are the two books that I'm reading, so it's going to be lunch poems.
Yeah, that was a trip. They just happened to be the two books that I was reading at the time. So I said, that's obviously the title we want to go with. So we probably had a list of about 20 different titles that I came up with a bunch, and then Michael came up with a bunch, and that was one of his. So thanks, Faye.
Awesome. And I have just two more questions. I want to check in time-wise. I know we're a little bit past the time. Do the two of you feel okay to answer? Yeah, okay.
More great.
Want to respect that. So this next question comes from Nora, and Nora's hoping that you can both talk about your processes a little bit. I know that you've done that a bit, but Nora clarifies, do you set aside particular times to write, scribble things and throw them into a file until combustion? I'm wondering also, like, does it vary from poem to poem? Do you find that your process changes based on the work that you're doing? Yeah.
For me, my wife, Marianne Hawley, and I retired. We quit our jobs, and we said if we were going to take this leap, it was to write. We were going to just dedicate ourselves, and it took so long to to get to this point that neither one of us are going to squander it. So we get up in the morning and start writing, and then we have dinner and have an evening together. But every day is writing, and I so far haven't gotten tired of it, and still feel like I have a whole lot of catching up to do.
Yeah, it's still a real struggle for me to get to writing, because I have other parts of my life, things that I do. And if I could do nothing, but if I could get away with only doing one thing, it would be writing, because I think that's what I should be doing. And I don't have a kind of steady time or process. There was an article written about me in Chicago years ago by Achille Bejas, and it kind of started off by talking about, I don't know if that was that article or one in the Tribune, but it talked about me writing while I was walking down the street, and just this kind of person who was like trying to find whatever moment they had to write. Things are not quite like that anymore, but I am very project driven. And one of my goals is to be able to write without having a project, without having a deadline, without someone coming to me and saying, listen, we want you to do A. And so I do B, right? I write something in response to it. Or, like a reading like this. I paid a lot more attention to these fragmented stills than I paid attention to for a while, because they kind of really fit with this particular program, poems about place and city. And I am really driven by writing about place. I mean, when I went back and kind of paid attention to my books, that's one of the things that really stood out to me. And so I'm constantly, because there are so many things that I'm engaged in and so many things that I asked to do, that I'm often responding as a writer to those situations. That video that I did for the Chinese Cultural Center, first of all, I don't know when that poem would have come out. The poem was already in me, but I don't know if I would have written it and when I would have written it if they hadn't said, listen, we want you to respond to this. And that became an impetus and an outlet for me to say, okay, I'm going to do this. The poem that I wrote on Bob Kaufman, I was asked to read at the release of the collection of his works from City Lights. And I really worked to write something that to me was relevant to Bob Kaufman's contributions. And then I was asked to do a video on it. And so I went to North Beach and I looked for locations and I shot a poem, on location. I read the poem that I wrote about Bob Kaufman. It's a somewhat passive thing that those were written because someone asked me to do something. I could have said no, or I could have not labored so diligently to make it a piece of art, because writing isn't art. You have to turn writing into art, and that's the big challenge. So that's what happens a lot for me, except with a poem like, again, it may even be the same thing with the serial poem I'm writing, What Not to Do. I'm constantly paying attention to these shootings by the police. And I respond to those shootings in that poem. And so I'm paying attention to something that maybe I wouldn't be paying attention as much to, but I'm also struggling to write it and to fit it into this kind of ongoing piece of art. So yeah, I guess I'm an observer and a responder. That's largely what still makes me write.
Thank you. And so the last question we have tonight dovetails on that a little bit, which this is also from Patricia, and she says, Chicago poets have a long history of collaboration with other artists. Are the two of you brainstorming with visual artists, photographers, dancers, musicians? etc. And also, I'm kind of wondering, like, if a collaboration changes that way that you work, rather than perhaps having a deadline, having another contributor.
I haven't done much. When Mary and I were courting, we tried to do poems together, and you know, they didn't go anywhere. The relationship went somewhere, but the
Fortunately, the
poem,
relationship did.
but I haven't. And I would like to, but I can say that I would like to seek that out, but I haven't so far.
Yeah, I've done a lot of that, and particularly with musicians, which really makes me appreciate musicians, by the way. You know, there's kind of like this struggle with the poet is getting every line, every period, every comma, you want it exactly the way it's supposed to be. And for music that's not composed, right? Musicians, they love playing the music differently every time they play it, which would drive me crazy sometimes, you know, particularly when you're recording, because there would be this one recording that for me just kind of captured everything the way I wanted it. And I wanted them to play the music like that every single time. No way. I finally, it was a growth process for me personally to stop wanting that and trying to demand it. I have collaborated with musicians, with visual artists, with playwrights, and today I find myself doing more and more writing in reaction to images, which is something I'm asked to do, but also something I'm very, very much committed to on my own. I have another series that I do, which called There's a Poem Somewhere Inside of This. And what it does is it takes an image and it uses the image as a prompt to write. So that's a big part of my life as a writer. It's collaborating with other artists. And I'll just say one more thing about it. When I moved from Chicago back to San Francisco, I had been involved in a collaboration with the great bass player, Mitar Mitch Kovic, and Mitch had played with David Hernandez and, you know, composed the music for David Hernandez and Street Sounds for years and just wrote beautiful music. We did a lot of collaborating together, but the musician was always responding to me because I was reciting poems that had been around for years, and they had a cadence to them. They had music to them as if they were composed. And so when I would work with musicians, it was like, keep up. I mean, I wasn't really thinking that way, but that's what it amounted to, because I wasn't really responding to the musician. The musician was only responding to me. And when I was asked to write a piece for Fred Fine's memorial, he left it in his will that I was responsible for the poetry at his memorial. And so I could have like asked a famous poet to read it, the thing, but I felt the best thing to do to respect him was to write a piece. And again, as I've said, I'm not good at writing on commission. But anyway, I made it even more complicated by asking Mitch Kovic if he would write music to it. And we got together, and boy, it was amazing how rapidly Mitch I just gave him the images that I was seeing and before I'd even written anything. And it worked out beautifully. It really did. I had 2 weeks, and we came up with quite a work of art, I have to say. But what I realized in that process, this was before I moved to San Francisco, back to San Francisco, is that what was different that time is that neither of us had created anything yet. Mitch was creating music from the same point that I was trying to write. And so we started at the same place. So it was the first time that we were truly collaborating. And I was listening to the music. I was listening to him because I didn't have this composed piece in my mind. And so I was really fortunate because by the time I arrived in San Francisco, and that's one of the things about the Red Poppy Art House, it's mostly a venue for music. And I found myself collaborating with all these amazing musicians. And so I kind of brought that with me from Chicago, from that experience that I had.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Mike. This has been wonderful, and I want to thank y'all for being here. Congratulations on your book, Mike.
Thank you so much.
Buy the book.
Buy the book from Booksmith. We'll send it right to you. And as I mentioned earlier, we're offering free shipping throughout San Francisco and the East Bay for those of you who are local. You could also pick it up from the store, no problem. And links for Michael's books also available in the chat, which I've shared, and as well as his upcoming appearances. Hopefully I'll see some of you at those. And hopefully we can all meet in person in the nearest future. But until then, please take care and continue to be safe. And hopefully we'll meet on the internet until then.
Thank you.
Thank you for this.
Take care. Thanks a lot, Michael. That was great.
That was wonderful.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, everybody. This
Thanks,
was
Devin.
fabulous.
My pleasure. Good night, everyone.
Take care.